Talia Gillis is joining us from Columbia University. Her talk with Bryce McLaughlin from Stanford University and Jann Spiess from Columbia is titled "On the Fairness of Machine-Assisted Human Decisions." Thank you so much for joining us and for your patience, Talia. You have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for including me in the workshop. And I'm sorry I'm not able to be there in person. I'm Talia Gillis from Columbia University, and I'll be talking about this joint work with Jann, Spiess, and Bryce McLaughlin from Stanford University, in which we consider how properties of machine predictions affect resulting human decisions. So when we analyze the fairness of algorithms used for decision-making in critical domains, we need to pay attention to how an algorithmic decision is applied. So one way an algorithmic prediction is applied is by directly translating the prediction into a decision. So suppose we've trained a model to predict borrower creditworthiness, so that when we have a new applicant, we provide the model with their features, which then translates into a decision with respect to the borrower's credit limit. This is what we call automation, and a significant part of the algorithmic fairness literature, and also much of the legal and policy literature, focuses either explicitly or implicitly on analyzing a prediction when an algorithm implements a decision directly. But in many critical applications, we see a very different model in which a prediction is given to a human decision maker that has decision-making authority. So for example, you could have some algorithmic recommendation, like a prediction of creditworthiness, but a human would decide the credit limit. And this is what we call assistance. And this model of decision-making in which an algorithm acts as a decision aid to a human decision maker is prevalent in many critical decision-making domains, such as employment and bail decisions, but it's also often mandated by legal rules. And perhaps the most salient recent example of this is the EU proposed regulation of AI, circulated in April last year, which is this attempt to provide a regulatory framework across domains. And we can see in Article 14 the requirement of human oversight in high-risk domains. And Section 4 says that human oversight means that a human should be able to decide not to use a high-risk AI system, disregard, override, or reverse the output. And so in our paper, what we do is we compare some of the results of the algorithmic fairness literature to their counterparts in a decision system where a human decision maker takes the prediction as an input. And so what we do is we compare two very simple algorithms, essentially conditional averages, which vary based on whether they use a protected characteristic, focusing on gender, to inform some prediction. We also extend the analysis to consider more generally the implications of excluding or including variables when forming the conditional average. So for example, we compare conditional averages that vary on whether they use a characteristic that's correlated with a protected characteristic, like a proxy. Then we have our data, which is used for a prediction, and then this prediction is either automatically translated into a decision or given to a human decision maker. And we have two main metrics of interest. We have our fairness metric, which is the expected difference in decision across gender, holding all other features consistent. So you can think of X as this kind of large covariate set, and accuracy being the expected mean square error of the decision. And so what we do is we compare these two metrics when we include and exclude the protected characteristics in the two structures of decision: automation, where the decision itself is a conditional average, and assistance, when the decision is determined by a human who has some prior beliefs seeking to maximize accuracy after seeing the conditional average. So in our setup, we have the same prediction algorithm, but we have a human that decides what to do essentially with that prediction. And the key insight is that the usual trade-off between accuracy and fairness may revert. And specifically with automation, using gender to form a conditional average increases disparity, simply because it allows for the direct differentiation based on gender. This is the classic trade-off between accuracy and fairness. But under assistance, the causal effect of including gender completely depends on who is getting the signal. And the way we demonstrate this is by focusing on a context of a decision maker with biased beliefs. In such a case, the use of gender in the conditional average can decrease disparity, creating an alignment between risk minimization and fairness. And so just to clarify, we're not arguing that including protected characteristics always reduces disparities. Rather, it can, because decision outcomes depend on who receives the signal and then makes the decision. So just to briefly kind of lay out our setup, we imagine a task in which the task is to use individuals' observable covariates and their protected characteristic gender to make a prediction decision, where the goal is a decision that when measured against the true label, minimize expected mean square error. So that's our loss function. We have access to some training data. So think of that as kind of past borrowers, an example of the assessment of creditworthiness. And we have two prediction algorithms, a conditional average without gender and a conditional average with gender. We assume that the human decision maker has prior beliefs and takes the decision to minimize expected loss given the conditional average. So there's no misalignment in preferences here. And our two properties of interest, again, are the decision disparities and decision accuracy. And we assume that there may be differences across group and that the difference in beliefs are greater than the true differences. That means that we consider the case that the priors are misspecified. And so I'll use a stylized example just to demonstrate the intuition of our result. So let's assume that there's only one type of X characteristics or type of X characteristics, so that all that distinguishes people is their gender. And the data and priors are normally distributed. And even though the true means may be distinct for men and women, we assume that the differences in priors of the human decision maker is greater than the true differences in mean. So before going on to the human decision, let's consider the predictions of the algorithm itself. We would trivially find that allowing the use of gender in the prediction function essentially allows a decision to change on the basis of gender. So the use of gender may increase accuracy, but also increase disparities. Again, this is the classic trade-off between accuracy and disparities. But what we want to consider now is not what happens when the algorithm is applied directly, but when it's used as a signal for a human decision maker. So now the decision maker is given the conditional average, which they combine with their prior to create a posterior expectation. What happens when the conditional average does not include gender? So these are the decision maker's beliefs of the distribution of default probability for men and women. So stereotypically, the men are blue and the women are red. And the lines are the expectation of the prior for men and women. And the black line is the average expectation of the combined prior for men and women. Suppose the decision maker has access to a conditional average without gender. In this example, it's lower than the prior average. This leads to a decision that is shifted in the same way for men and women. Intuitively, the decision maker only updates with respect to the combined averages, but not the differences in averages. What happens when we provide a signal with gender? Again, these are the decision maker's beliefs for men and women, and now you receive a separate signal for men and women. This leads to a shift in the posteriors for men and women. So by having the separate means, the decision for men and women become close to one another, meaning that under these particular assumptions, you counter bias through presenting information that includes gender. And the paper discusses the example of normal priors and also shows the results under general priors. So just to conclude, when we consider the impact of an algorithm, we have to be sensitive to how it's going to be implemented. When we choose or are required to use algorithms as an input rather than as decision makers, we must evaluate the combined impact of the human and algorithm rather than treat the algorithm as the be-all and end-all of the decision for the purposes of evaluating their fairness properties. I'll stop sharing there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talia. Speaker. We have time for one question, either online or in the room.
Hi, Talia. Thanks for the presentation. So I'm curious about the trade-off between accuracy and fairness they're talking about. So in the second case, once you incorporate gender, right, you get different signals for the genders, and then you can calibrate your decisions based on your priors with them. But I don't necessarily see how that would make your decisions more accurate. I can see how it reduces the disparity. So I don't know how exactly it mitigates this trade-off. It seems to me that there's still going to be a trade-off.
So the idea is basically, I mean, tracking many domains in which potentially when you provide more information or you provide more of an ability to differentiate between individuals, and potentially you can increase your accuracy of the prediction, because rather than people kind of being lumped together, you have kind of less coarse distinctions between people. So according to the measure of accuracy we use, kind of the expected mean square error, that would potentially increase the accuracy of the prediction. But I guess the point is that if you also care about the disparity measures, then potentially if you have these differences between groups, and there's this gap between the prior and what's true of the world. And we may be skeptical about that in many contexts. We're working on an experiment currently that's trying to test this in a very particular domain. We think, for example, when it comes to predicting math scores for men and women, that people have this kind of inaccurate statistical bias, that they think they're greater gender gaps than they truly are. And so we're testing in a kind of an experimental setting the idea that when you provide people with kind of an assistance, with a conditional average of how a group of test takers performed in a test, if you give them a signal that's kind of gender specific, ultimately what you result in is smaller disparities in predictions of test scores for men and women.
Okay.
So we agree this might not be true in many domains, but we think it can be true. And if that's true, then the proposed EU regulation, for example, when it comes to auditing algorithms, shouldn't require just auditing the algorithm in isolation, but really auditing the decision-making system in which the algorithm is being used.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's clear to me that once you incorporate, more demographic information, you can improve the accuracy of your prediction. I'm just wondering, sort of, the joint decision outcome, whether that would be actually more accurate or not, given human might have incorrect priors. But yeah, look forward to the experiments. Thanks.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I misunderstood your question.
No, yes. That's totally fine. I think you expanded very well. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Talia. We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.